I recently spoke with an older gentleman who lived through the Glico Morinaga summer in 1984 Osaka. He described a peculiar, heavy silence that settled over the local grocery stores. He remembered standing in front of a confectionery shelf, watching a store clerk systematically dump hundreds of brightly colored candy boxes into a heavy black trash bag. The clerk didn't look angry. He looked defeated, almost embarrassed. My friend told me that for the first time in his life, a simple chocolate bar felt like a loaded gun. At the start, the public saw it as a straightforward, if brutal, crime. The president of the Glico Candy Company snatched from his own bathtub by masked men. We expected the usual sequence: a ransom demand, a tense drop-off, and an eventual arrest. It was a tragedy, but a logical one. But then the logic evaporated. The kidnapper escaped, yet the criminals didn't hide. Instead, they began writing letters to the national press, signed with the theatrical alias The Monster with 21 Faces. They didn't sound like desperate thugs. They sounded like board directors critiquing a play. They taunted the police for their clumsy investigations and, most chillingly, announced they had laced boxes of popular snacks with cyanide. Suddenly, the nation wasn't just watching a crime drama. They were involuntary participants in a psychological experiment. What left investigators truly stunned, however, was the monster's behavior regarding the money. Despite multiple opportunities to collect massive ransoms, the group seemed to prioritize the spectacle over the cash. They would lead police on elaborate wild goose chases, only to vanish without taking a cent. It led to a disturbing realization. If this wasn't about the ransom, what was the real endgame? As the stock prices of Japan's food giants began to plummet in rhythm with every new taunting letter, a more calculated theory emerged. One that suggested the monster wasn't a madman at all, but a master of market manipulation who knew exactly how much fear was worth on the open exchange.
Wow. Just hearing that laid out, it really sets the tone. It's a narrative that fundamentally changes how we view crime in the late 20th century.
It does.
Here. And, we aren't just looking at a kidnapping case that went cold here. We are looking at a systemic stress test, one that it nearly broke the third largest economy in the world at the time.
That concept of a stress test is exactly what we need to focus on today. Usually when people discuss the Glico Morinaga case, they get obsessed with the who, was the Yakuza, was it North Korea?
Right, or some disgruntled insider.
Exactly. But for this deep dive, we are ignoring the who. Our mission today is to look at the what. We're going to use this case as a blueprint because it really exposed three massive vulnerabilities in modern society. We're talking about the manipulation of financial markets, the fragility of social trust, and the weaponization of media narratives.
And to really understand those vulnerabilities, we have to strip away the nostalgia. It's so easy for us to look back at 1984 with a sense of distance, thinking that our modern digital infrastructure protects us from this kind of analog terror.
Yeah, that it's just a thing of the past.
But the reality is the opposite. The monster with 21 faces didn't just commit a crime, they basically invented a new category of asymmetric warfare against a corporate state. They showed that you don't need an army to destabilize a nation.
You just need a narrative, a typewriter, and an understanding of how markets react to fear.
Exactly.
Let's start with that market reaction, because I think the most baffling part of the case for the police at the time was the money.
Absolutely, the ransom drops.
They were setting up roadblocks, carrying fake ransom money to drop points, engaging in high-speed chases. But the criminals never seemed to actually want the physical cash.
Yeah, they would set a date, demand $1 billion, and then just not show up.
Or they would send the police to a location where there was nothing but a mocking note, which is crazy.
If you look at it through the lens of traditional kidnapping, it makes zero sense. Kidnapping is a high-risk transaction. You take the hostage, you trade for cash, you leave.
You want to get paid and get out.
But if you look at it through the lens of financial speculation, the quote-unquote failed ransom drops were not failures at all.
They were market signals.
Exactly. Every time a ransom drop failed or a new threat was issued to the public, the uncertainty spiked. And in financial markets, as you know, uncertainty is the primary driver of volatility.
I heard a story about a veteran clerk working in a dimly lit Osaka brokerage firm in 1984, long before the era of digital dashboards. While the rest of Japan was staring in horror at news reports of poisoned choco mints, this man was staring at the ticker tape. He noticed something cold and calculated. A series of aggressive sell orders hitting the market just hours before the monster with 21 faces mailed their taunting letters to the press. In that analog world, market surveillance was a game of manual ledgers and gut feelings. The monster didn't need to pick up a ransom bag under a bridge. They simply watched the stock prices of Glico and Morinaga collapse, likely profiting from the very chaos they authored. Try to imagine the frustration of investigators who were looking for kidnappers in the streets while the real theft was happening in the invisible flow of capital. As I look back on this through my lens as a news commentator, it strikes me how defenseless the 1980s infrastructure was against such information-age crimes. Today we have AI-driven anomaly detection that would flag such patterns in a heartbeat. But this story serves as a haunting reminder that technology only moves as fast as our imagination of what a crime can be. It's a sobering thought that the most dangerous criminals aren't those who break into safes, but those who understand the cracks in the system better than the regulators do.
That clerk was witnessing what we now call the stock price hypothesis, but he was watching it happen in a vacuum. To understand why this was even possible, we have to understand short selling in the context of 1984 Japan.
Let's clarify those mechanics for a second, just so we're all on the same page. Short selling is essentially betting that a stock will go down.
Right.
You borrow the stock, sell it at the current high price, wait for it to crash, buy it back at the low price, return the stock to the lender, and pocket the difference.
Correct. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the monster. You know you are about to send a letter to the Mainichi Shimbun saying, "We have put cyanide in Morinaga chocolate."
A terrifying letter.
You know, with absolute certainty that Morinaga's stock is going to tank the moment that news hits the stands.
That's guaranteed panic.
So before you mail the letter, you initiate a massive short position. You don't need to be anywhere near a ransom drop. You can be sitting in a coffee shop, watching the ticker tape, knowing that every percentage point drop in the stock is millions of yen in your pocket.
And Morinaga's stock fell from a high of 670 yen to a low of 380 yen.
That is nearly a 50% drop.
Which is massive.
The profit potential there is astronomical. And it is completely detached from the physical risk of picking up a bag of cash under a bridge surrounded by cops.
This is where I get stuck. If someone places a massive bet against a company right before a terror threat against that specific company, shouldn't that trigger every alarm bell in the country? I mean, if I did that today, regulators would be breaking down my door before the trade even settled.
Yeah, it would.
So why didn't the Japanese authorities see this happening back then?
This is the critical piece of the puzzle. You are applying 21st century regulatory logic to a 1980s market. The Japanese regulatory landscape in the mid-80s wasn't just technologically behind, it was philosophically opposed to the kind of surveillance we take for granted today.
Wait, you mean the government didn't want to catch insider traders?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. The Ministry of Finance at the time held what was actually described as a negative view on strict insider trading regulations.
Really? A negative view?
Yes. You have to understand the corporate culture of the bubble era. There was a sense that the market was an insider's game. Information was basically a perk of the job. If you were a bank executive or a major shareholder, knowing things before the public was seen by some as a privilege of your position, not a crime.
So it was essentially an old boys club mentality.
So, at the time, insider trading was only considered a violation if it breached general anti-fraud provisions.
Okay.
But these provisions were incredibly broad and vague. To prosecute someone, you had to prove a specific malicious intent to defraud, which, legally speaking, is very difficult.
So it wasn't enough to just show they traded on non-public information.
Right, you had to prove they were actively running a scam.
If I'm just trading smart based on info I stole, I'm technically not defrauding anyone in their eyes.
Yes, and we actually saw this play out in other cases around the same time. Take the Hanshin Neo-Industrial case in 1987.
That was just 2 years after Glico, right?
Exactly. A major bank sold off all its holdings in a chemical company right before the company declared insolvency. It was blindingly obvious they used inside information to dump the bad stock on the public.
Wow.
The Osaka Stock Exchange investigated, and the conclusion was maddening. They announced they could find, quote-unquote, no evidence of wrongdoing.
Because they didn't have the tools to find it, or because the law didn't let them call it wrongdoing?
A combination of both. They lacked the digital surveillance to prove who knew what and when, and they lacked the statutory teeth to bite even if they knew. The monster with 21 faces was operating in this exact gap.
That makes so much sense now.
They knew the police were looking for kidnappers, people who physically grab bodies and money. They knew the police were not looking for traders. They were exploiting a regulatory vacuum that the government had intentionally left open.
It really highlights how crime often forces the law to evolve. We just don't write laws for things we can't imagine happening.
That is the persistent pattern of history. It wasn't until 1988, largely driven by public outrage over cases like Glico and that Hanshin incident, that Japan finally amended the Securities and Exchange Law.
Well, that must have been a huge shift.
It was the turning point. It explicitly criminalized insider trading and established strict reporting requirements. It forced the market to move from an insider's game to an actually regulated public exchange. The Glico case was the catalyst that ended the era of the Wild West in Japanese finance.
But if we fast forward to today, we have closed that specific loop. We have laws, we have regulators watching every tick. But the monster's logic hasn't gone away, has it? It has just changed its skin.
It has evolved from a human problem to a computational one. In 1984, the monster was a human exploiting a manual system. Today, the potential monster is an algorithm exploiting an automated system. We are in an arms race of artificial intelligence.
Explain that a bit more, because I think most of us assume AI makes us safer. It watches every trade, finds the anomalies, right?
It does do that. Regulators use AI to detect patterns that look like spoofing or layering.
Spoofing being?
Spoofing is a classic manipulation tactic. A trader places a massive order to buy or sell with no intention of actually executing it. They put the order on the book just to create a mirage of demand.
To fake out the market.
Exactly. Other traders see this whale coming in and react, driving the price up or down. Then, milliseconds before the order executes, the spoofer cancels it. They just profited from the price movement they faked.
So it's a digital bluff.
A bluff that happens in microseconds. Now, regulators have AI that hunts for these bluffs. Sure. The criminals have AI too. We are seeing the rise of black box manipulation.
Black box implies we don't really know what's going on inside.
Right. Modern hedge funds and trading firms use complex machine learning models to maximize profit. They give the AI a goal, make as much money as possible. They don't necessarily tell it how. There is a genuine fear among market theorists that an AI, in its pursuit of profit, might independently learn that market manipulation is the most efficient strategy.
Without being told to do it.
Right. It might figure out that spoofing works without a human ever explicitly programming it to break the law.
Terrifying. You're saying we could have a scenario where an AI becomes the monster with 21 faces just because the mass told it to?
It is the ultimate evolution of the Glico strategy. The Glico criminals were rational actors who realized physical extortion was inefficient compared to stock manipulation. And AI is the ultimate rational actor.
Because it has no emotions, no fear of getting caught.
If the code determines that crashing a stock is the best way to hit its quarterly target, it will try to crash the stock. And unlike the video man caught on security cameras in 1984, an algorithm has no face. It has no body to arrest. It is just code running on a server farm in a jurisdiction the police can't reach.
So the lesson from 1984 isn't just about candy bars and physical threats. It's that whenever there is a system, whether it's a manual ledger or a high-frequency trading platform, there is someone or something analyzing the rules to find the one exploit that breaks the game.
And while the financial system is one target, the Glico case showed us that the most vulnerable system isn't actually the stock market. It's the social contract.
Which brings us perfectly to the second pillar of this deep dive, the sociology of trust. Because you can't talk about this case without talking about the atmosphere in Japan at the time. We're talking about a society that prides itself on safety, on order, on harmony.
Japan is what sociologists call a high-context society. Communication and interaction depend heavily on shared cultural understanding and reputation.
As opposed to a low-context society.
Right. In a low-context society, like perhaps the US, a transaction is essentially just a contract. If I buy a product and it's bad, I sue you. In a high-context society, a transaction is a relationship. A brand like Morinaga wasn't just selling chocolate, they were selling a promise of safety. They were a guest in your home.
I saw an old interview online featuring a mother who lived through the Glico Morinaga panic, and her words stayed with me. She described the eerie silence in the candy aisles of Tokyo supermarkets, not because the shelves were empty, but because they were full of colorful boxes that no one dared to touch. In the high-context, high-trust society of 1980s Japan, a brand wasn't just a product, it was a promise of safety. When that promise was broken by a few anonymous letters, the social fabric didn't just tear, it curdled. She spoke of the shame felt by the corporate executives, some of whom felt a personal responsibility so deep it bordered on the tragic, simply because their face had been tarnished. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a sociological one. Attempting to visualize that period, I realized that the monster wasn't just poisoning food. They were weaponizing the very loyalty that built the Japanese miracle. Reading this account, I felt a deep sense of empathy for a population that suddenly found its cultural strengths, collectivism, and brand trust turned into vulnerabilities. It reminds us that market stability in East Asia isn't just about numbers. It's about the or harmony of the public. Once that harmony is compromised, the economic damage is far more permanent than any physical loss. We must recognize that protecting a brand's reputation is, in many ways, a matter of national security.
That phrase, the shelf full of colorful boxes no one dared to touch, is just the perfect image of reputational death. The monster completely understood that they didn't need to poison all the candy. They just needed to poison the idea of the candy.
And the reaction from the retailers was brutal. It wasn't a slow decline, it was immediate. Major chains like Dai, Isetan, Matsuzakaya, these are the absolute titans of Japanese retail. They pulled every single Morinaga product.
Too. In a culture of collective responsibility, the retailer shares the burden of the manufacturer.
Right, their reputation is on the line too.
Exactly. If Dai sold a poisoned candy, Dai would lose face alongside Morinaga. So the entire supply chain collapsed overnight. Morinaga had to halt production at their factories. We are talking about 450 part-time workers, fired people who had absolutely nothing to do with corporate strategy, losing their livelihoods because of a psychological game played by anonymous criminals.
And the executives, the psychological toll on them was immense. I read about the police superintendent in Shiga Prefecture. Yes, Yamamoto. He was the head of the police in the region where the monster famously escaped a massive dragnet.
The pressure on him was unimaginable. The public shame of failing to protect the harmony was so intense that he committed suicide. He literally set himself on fire.
That is a level of accountability that is hard for a lot of people to comprehend today.
It demonstrates that in this cultural context, failure is not just an operational error, it is a moral stain. And the monster knew this. They weaponized the concept of honor. They knew that by humiliating the police and the corporations, they were inflicting a wound far deeper than financial loss. They were stripping these powerful men of their dignity.
But here's where the story shifts. Glico was essentially a corporate attack. It was about brands and money and reputation. But as we move forward in history, we see this vulnerability morph into something much more physical.
Because the Glico case was, for all its terror, essentially bloodless.
Right, no one actually died from the poison candy, but that luck ran out in 1998.
The Wakayama curry incident. This is the moment where the abstract fear of Glico became a concrete tragedy, and it is crucial to understand the connection between the two.
Because one laid the groundwork for the other.
Yes. Glico exposed that the economy was fragile to poison. Wakayama exposed that the actual safety infrastructure was fragile to poison.
Let's set the scene for Wakayama because it's a very different vibe. This wasn't a corporate boardroom or a supermarket chain. This was a summer festival in a quiet neighborhood.
July 25th, 1998. The Sonobe District in Wakayama City. It's a classic community event. The Residents Association is cooking massive pots of curry in a garage to serve to the neighbors.
It's a definition of community trust.
Yeah.
You just eat the food your neighbor cooked for you.
And then absolute chaos. People start vomiting, children start collapsing.
And this is where the system completely failed, didn't it?
The initial diagnosis at the hospitals was food poisoning. You have to remember, Japan had seen massive outbreaks of O157, a virulent strain of E. coli, in the years prior to this.
So they were primed to look for that.
Exactly. So when dozens of people showed up at the hospital with vomiting and convulsions, the doctors immediately went into food poisoning mode. They were administering gastric irrigation and intravenous drips designed to flush out bacteria.
But it wasn't bacteria.
No, it was arsenic trioxide, a heavy metal poison. And the treatment for arsenic is radically different.
What do you need to treat that?
You need specific chelating agents to bind the heavy metal so the body can expel it. But because the doctors were treating for E. coli, they were losing precious time.
The timeline on this is heartbreaking to read. The chairman of the Residents Association, a 64-year-old man, died at 3:03 a.m. the next morning. At that point, the doctors still didn't know it was poison.
The information gap was lethal. The police suspected poison earlier than the doctors, but the communication channels were totally broken. The director of the local health center actually found out it was cyanide, which, by the way, was the initial incorrect police theory by watching the 7 a.m. news on television.
Really? The health director found out from the morning news?
Yes. Imagine being the doctor in charge, fighting to save a child's life, and you have to turn on the TV to find out what toxic substance might be in their blood.
That is a catastrophic failure of protocol.
It was a nightmare. And then, to add to the confusion, the police announced it was cyanide, only to realize days later it was actually arsenic. The symptoms are different, but in the chaos, they just missed the signs.
It really highlighted that Japan's safety infrastructure was built on the assumption of a safe society.
Hospitals were ready for accidents and bacteria. They were not ready for chemical terror.
So Glico was the warning that the myth of safety could be broken, and Wakayama was the proof that the system couldn't handle the break.
Exactly. And Wakayama forced a massive regulatory overhaul. This is the bridge between the two events. After Glico, they fixed the financial laws. After Wakayama, they fixed the chemical laws. The government amended the Poisonous and Deleterious Substances Control Law. They mandated strict theft prevention measures for chemicals. They required material safety data sheets, or MSDS, to be instantly available so information could travel faster than the morning news.
It seems like the lesson Japan learned, incredibly painfully, is that trust is not a strategy. You can't just trust that your neighbor won't poison the curry. You have to verify.
It marked the end of the innocent era of high trust. The society moved from implicit trust to explicit verification. We verify supply chains now. We seal packaging. We track chemical purchases.
Tamper evidence seals on everything.
Right. The Glico monster and the Wakayama tragedy forced Japan to build a hard shell around its soft culture.
There's one more player in this tragedy that we haven't fully dissected yet. We've talked about the market and we've talked about trust, but the monster had a megaphone.
Yeah.
Imagine being a young journalist in 1984, sitting at a desk in the newsroom where the fax machine begins to spit out a letter from a self-proclaimed monster. I read about how these journalists became the unintended accomplices of the criminals. Because the Japanese media landscape was so concentrated and influential, the monster with 21 faces used the press as a megaphone to bypass the police and speak directly to the hearts of millions. The media felt a duty to inform, but in doing so, they provided the oxygen for the fire of public panic. The monster was a master of the media circus, turning a criminal investigation into a national reality show. This historical exploitation of the media is a direct ancestor to the modern disinformation campaigns we see today. As someone who navigates the digital media space daily, I find this story particularly chilling. It shows that even with the best intentions, the media can be weaponized to destabilize social cohesion. While the 1980s had a few powerful gatekeepers, today we have millions of decentralized voices, yet the core vulnerability remains the same: our susceptibility to fear-based narratives. Reflecting on this, I feel it's crucial to balance our right to know with the responsibility of not becoming a tool for those who wish to sow discord. The monster may have disappeared, but the blueprint they left for manipulating the public mind is still very much in use.
The term media circus is often thrown around casually, but in the Glico case, it was literal. The monster treated the entire investigation like entertainment. They understood the psychology of the news cycle better than the editors did.
I mean, they gave themselves a villain name right out of the gate. The monster with 21 faces. That is straight out of Edogawa Ranpo's famous detective novels.
It was a brilliant, if twisted, signal to the public. It said, "This is a story, watch us perform."
And by sending the letters directly to the major dailies, the Yomiuri, the Mainichi, they ensured maximum distribution.
In 1984, these newspapers had circulations in the millions. There was no internet, no decentralized media. If it was printed in the Yomiuri, it was effectively absolute truth for the entire population. The monster hacked the centralized media server.
And the content of those letters was designed to go viral, even before we used that word. They didn't just threaten, they entertained, they actively mocked the police.
Writing things like, "Dear dumb police officers," or "You should save some energy for the marathon."
It's so brazen. They made the police look totally incompetent, which is dangerous for society.
It creates a vacuum of authority. If the police are being publicly humiliated by a guy with a typewriter who is actually in charge, the Fox-Eyed Man is another great example of this.
Oh, right, the sketch.
The police released this sketch of a suspect with these sharp, fox-like eyes. It was plastered everywhere. It became an icon of the era, but it was entirely useless.
Because it just made everyone paranoid.
Exactly. It led to thousands of false tips. The monster used the police's own desperate need for public help to flood the system with noise.
This connects directly to what we see today with information-based manipulation. We mentioned GameStop earlier, but let's go a bit deeper there. The Glico case was a centralized group manipulating the masses. GameStop was a decentralized mass manipulating the market.
But the underlying mechanic is identical. Narrative drives value. In the Glico case, the narrative was poison and fear. In GameStop, the narrative was a rebellion, sticking it to the hedge funds.
In both cases, the fundamental, actual value of the company became completely irrelevant.
Right. The stock price was no longer a reflection of earnings or revenue. It was simply a reflection of the story being told in the media.
And today, that story moves at the speed of light. We have seen flash crashes caused by a single fake tweet. There was that incident a few years ago where a hacked account tweeted that there was an explosion at the White House. The market dipped billions of dollars in seconds before anyone could correct it.
That tweet was the modern Glico letter. It was the digital equivalent of the cyanide in the chocolate note. And as AI gets better at generating fake news, creating realistic videos, audio, and articles, we are entering an era of deepfake markets.
Where you don't even need a hacked account.
Exactly. Imagine an AI that doesn't just spoof the trade, but generates the completely fabricated news article that explains the trade to the market, forcing everyone else to react.
That is the convergence of all three of our pillars today. The AI manipulates the market by breaking the trust, using the media as the weapon.
The Glico case was a massive warning. It showed us that our systems, financial, social, and informational, are deeply, inextricably interconnected. You cannot secure one without securing the others.
The monster, with 21 faces, eventually just stopped writing letters. In August 1985, they sent their final message. They said the police commander's suicide was a win for them, and they were bored. They literally wrote, "It's a drag to make a kid cry because he's deprived of the candy he loves." And then silence.
They just walked away. No one was ever charged. The statute of limitations for the kidnapping expired in 1995, and for the attempted murder in 2000. They won.
It's incredibly unsatisfying, isn't it? As a society, we want the handcuffs.
Yeah.
We want the trial and the conviction.
But perhaps the lack of a conclusion is the most important part of the blueprint. It proves that the system can be beaten. If they had been caught, we could all say, well, the system worked in the end.
But they weren't. The system didn't work. So, to recap our deep dive today, we started with a kidnapping in 1984. But what we found was a singularity. The Glico Morinaga case wasn't just a crime. It was an audit.
An audit of Japan's soul and its systems. It exposed the negative view on insider trading regulation that allowed the monster to profit. It exposed the fragility of WA and how easily corporate shame can be weaponized.
It exposed the lack of chemical safety protocols that would later lead to the tragedy in Wakayama.
And it exposed the media's vulnerability to becoming a puppet for narrative terrorists.
The legacy of the monster is written in the laws we follow today. It's in the Securities and Exchange Law of 1988. It's in the Poisonous Substances Control Law of 1999. And it's in the algorithms fighting the invisible war in our stock markets right now.
We basically built a fortress of regulations on top of the ruins the monster left behind.
We tend to think of modern economies as running on money, on capital. But this deep dive really drives home that they run on trust.
Trust is the currency. Money is just a scorecard.
And when someone figures out how to poison the trust,
The whole system collapses.
I keep thinking about that final letter. We are bored. It's a drag. It sounds so dismissive. But considering how sophisticated they were, how they played the stock market, how they played the media, how they played the police, I have to leave you with this final thought.
Good.
The monster with 21 faces eventually stopped writing letters, claiming they were bored and that it was a drag to make a kid cry. But considering the immense sophistication of their market manipulation and media strategy, they didn't really get bored. They simply realized that in a rapidly globalizing, digitalizing world, they no longer needed to kidnap presidents or poison candy to hold an economy hostage. They just needed to wait for the invention of the algorithm.